Hi, I'm Adam, and welcome to the Cool Media Theater. This is a new segment on the channel called WTF Cinema. Since the rise of the Atari 2600, movies have provided inspiration for games, so much so that the idea that video games based on movies suck has become a tired cliche in and of itself. We all know of some of the most infamous examples of games based on movies that went horribly wrong. But that's not what this series is about. I'm looking at the games based on movies where the question isn't, how did this movie produce a shitty game? But rather, why did this movie produce a game at all? Even with so many movies getting video game adaptations, there are some cases where a movie doesn't seem to provide adequate game fodder and yet got one anyway. It could be a movie that had niche appeal that doesn't call for the investment required for games. It could be a movie that bombed so badly that studios were stupid to stump up more money for a game. I'm even inclined to talk about movies that may have warranted a game adaptation, but the game itself was done in a way that seemed nonsensical rather than just the game being bad. There are plenty of such examples to choose from, but I decided to kick off this project with the one that inspired me to start this series in the first place. Gentlemen, start your engines! In 2001, Sylvester Stallone starred in a little racing action film called Driven. SLY plays Joe Tonto, a former kart champion, who gets called out of retirement to support an up-and-coming racer named Jimmy Bly, a young hothead played by Kip Pardue. Now you may be thinking that this sounds very familiar. A former champion coaching a new prospect with an attitude that has to be dropped to become champion material? Doesn't that sound like the Pixar movie Cars? Sure, when you look at the major plot themes they're similar. But Driven does some things that Cars doesn't do. Namely, Michael Bay-style explosions, an insane race on the streets of Chicago, and a lot of leering at women. There's also a love triangle where Bly and his rival Bo Brandenburg, played by Til Schweiger, fight over the same woman. The movie isn't terrible, but it's nothing special either. It's very mediocre. Of course, mediocrity is a plus when you consider that the director, Renny Harlin, was the guy behind Cutthroat Island. And the production company, Franchise Pictures, made a little movie called Battlefield Earth the year before. If you want a racing movie with personality, that's what Days of Thunder and Talladega Nights are for. If you want a more thorough point-by-point breakdown of this movie, Film Brain did a review of it a long time ago, and I highly recommend checking it out. So, we have a thoroughly mediocre racing movie that was so mediocre that it couldn't get the Formula 1 license it was clearly gunning for and had to settle for the kart license instead. A movie that failed with the critics and bombed at the box office, that somehow managed to get a game on the PlayStation 2 and GameCube. How? Now, before I get into the Driven game itself, let's quickly talk about the box art. The PS2 version, which is the one I have, uses about the same cover as the DVD of the movie, complete with the close-up shot of one of Sly's eyes in his racing helmet. The logo for Franchise Pictures is even prominently displayed. Now look at the cover for the GameCube version, which released a year later. Notice anything missing? Like anything that suggests any connection to a movie? Seriously, no appearance of SLY on the cover, only the briefest of mentions on the back, and you even had to look hard back there for the Franchise Pictures logo. I love how the notes dared to call the movie a hit. Aren't there laws against false advertising? Of course, false advertising was Franchise Pictures' business model. That's why that studio went under faster than Canon did. Now, let's get into the game nobody asked for, based on the movie nobody wanted to see. First, I have to give it credit. The game does look like it was trying to have a flair of its own. Rather than using images from the movie itself, the art department went with a comic book style that reminds me a lot of the artwork for Boogie Nights. A weird direction to go, but not a bad idea at all. Stallone does provide his voice for the game, along with Greg Proops, whom I know from Whose Line Is It Anyway, and Eric Myers, a respected voice actor that the producers gave so little of a shit about that they didn't even spell his name correctly on the cover. The game has a decent number of options. including split-screen multiplayer, multiple tracks from the film, and a selection of racers to choose from, though you have to work to get access to the leads from the movie. Well, unless you have codes or a Game Shark handy. The game has a story mode which follows the plot of the film reasonably well, even including segments that make sense in context, like framing the tutorial as a test to see if Tonto is fit to come out of retirement and rejoin the team. I have to admit, I'm pleasantly surprised. Considering how movie-based games tend to be half-assed, designed to squeeze maximum money out of people for minimum effort, see Green Lantern and Ghostbusters on PS4 for proof of that, this game was clearly meant to provide a package that was actually worth $50. But now it's time to get to the gameplay, and here's where the problems come in. The driving physics go for a more arcadey feel like the Ridge Racer games, but that feels at odds with the use of those race cars. How often do you see Formula 1 racers power sliding? On top of that, there isn't really a difficulty scale. Be prepared to lose races over and over again until you pull off that one perfect line. There were no difficulty settings anywhere. This game is definitely not beginner friendly. There are also elements that are just weird. One aspect of the movie is the idea of being in the zone. Those were the times when Tonto would start whistling and his focus sharpens to the point that he's virtually flawless. The developers tried to implement that into the game and the results were odd. When you reach certain speeds without slowing down or hitting anything, the background sounds mute somewhat, and you start to hear a low whistle. On top of that, the graphics take on a weird blur effect, which, honestly, is very distracting. While I applaud the developers for trying to add quirks to a very bog-standard racing formula, the additions are more of a hindrance than a help, especially when they're paired with the almost unfair difficulty. I have no idea why Driven got a game adaptation. The movie is a very standard racing drama with a couple of odd moments. Seriously, the only noteworthy thing about it was having Sylvester Stallone taking a mentor role, which he would do more successfully later in Creed. As for the game, aside from a couple of weird quirks in its story mode, it's a very standard arcade racing game. It doesn't do anything really well, nor is it spectacularly awful. It's just kinda there. Much like the movie, now that I think about it. Everything the game does you can find done better elsewhere. Want to drive race cars? Play any of Codemaster's F1 games. Want sadistic difficulty that's actually worthwhile? Load up F-Zero GX for the GameCube or any of the Wipeout games. Want arcadey racing fun? Play any of the Ridge Racer games. Speaking of which, I should pencil in a retro replay of that series. Hell, if you want a broken game that's fun to laugh at least, load up Big Rigs. Driven is a by-the-numbers racing game that just happens to be tied to a movie that bombed in 2001. The only question I'm left with is, why the fuck does this even exist? So this was the first installment of WTF Cinema. Have any questions, comments, or suggestions for other movies that got unexpected or weird video games? Drop them in the comments below or send them to that Twitter right there. If you want to see more, give a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Next time I'm returning to a pricey horror RPG that deserves more time out of the treasure chest. Thanks for joining me in the Cool Media Theater, and game on.